Lindsay, when Mike Johnson was chosen as Speaker of the House, what what was going on what are the politics around that? Why is that important for this idea of Trump's attack on the administrative state?
Well, when that debate's actually happening, it's not clear that everything's going to look like it does right now because Speaker Johnson is selected after 3 weeks of a vacancy where House Republicans couldn't quite figure out who was going to lead them. And he emerges as this consensus candidate because he had already been in leadership. When he was elected to his smaller leadership position, it was unanimous. And no one, I don't think, at that time could have predicted that he was going to be someone who sort of went along with this ungoverning narrative as much as he's proven himself to be willing to do since the 119th Congress has started.
Now, that's a really interesting point because that would seem rather random and it just, good luck for Donald Trump that Johnson became Speaker. But he very quickly latched on to the tear up the administrative state narrative. Why do you think that he was so eager to do that?
Well, I think part of it is the context of governing the Republican conference within Congress. If we think about the 8 people who got together to make it so that Mike McCarthy got taken out, or Kevin McCarthy, excuse me, those were some of the most radical right, small government, no government, tear up government sort of factions of the Republican Party. And not all of them are still in the 119th Congress, but knowing that there was like this palpable energy and this palpable capacity for those sorts of voices or ideas to get through, I think makes it so that Speaker Johnson has had a really hard task of saying, like, okay, I've got to keep that side at bay. I also have a president who really wants to get the things done that he wants to get done. And most of the other conference is willing to go along with it. And so I think that sort of like all these things together make him this willing leader. It's not clear to me that if you truth serumed Mike Johnson and said, do you think government should do nothing? He would say yes. But I do think he has a lot of constraints that have pushed him into agreeing to this sort of perspective.
Is it fair to say that the ungoverned, Trump 2.0, the idea of ungoverning, it's not so much a deeply held strategy or a strategy that's deeply held by a lot of members of Congress or people in the Trump administration, where everything is, sort of directed to implementing that strategy, but it evolves and they manage it and they bring the people in as they're required. It's more chaotic than maybe we think.
I think it's actually much more chaotic than we think, and it's also far harder for us to know from an accountability sense because if we think about what ungoverning is, it's not no governing, it's governing by people who maybe aren't as accountable or visible. So when we reduce people in sort of like the administrative state or like the capacity to do something like rulemaking, someone's still going to make those rules. And if we've said government's not going to be able to do it, it's probably going to fall to the businesses that are regulated or the industries that are operating. And so it's not that these decisions aren't being made, they have to be made. It's that we don't know who's doing it. We don't have a path to accountability. It's not as clear. And so it's opaque in terms of like how you actually understand what's happening in that process.
So let me give you an example from my world. If we were talking about the EPA and the regulation of venting and flaring of methane from wells, there's a very specific example. And if the EPA backed away from that and said, no, we're going to let industry self-regulate, then industry is their incentive is to not reduce that, and let out and emit more methane because it's cheaper to do it, more efficient to do it from their point of view. And that, if you could, is that an example that you could apply to many other areas of government?
Absolutely. And it's not just that it's cheaper or more in their interest, it's that the harms are hard to witness. They are long term instead of immediate. And so, like, if you have more contaminated air or contaminated water or contaminated soil from any of that sort of activity, no one gets sick tomorrow. People, they slowly develop cancers. People have birth defects that are associated with these things. And then you're pointing the finger at a past actor, and you might be able to then look back and say, like, why didn't government do this? But by that point, it's so many years down the road. It's again this question of what is accountability and who has responsibility. Someone's going to make these choices, and if industry does it, you might get outputs that we don't want, but it's hard to see because it's going to be slow moving to figure out the impacts.
Now, one of the things that Trump 2.0 does is leans on loyalty over expertise. And how does that play into the process we just talked about?
So I think we can see that people can understand this in sort of their own personal life. You can see it at local government, state government, federal government just happens to be the biggest version of it. When you value something like loyalty over specific expertise or subject matter expertise, what you're sort of doing is operationalizing the preferences of that person who are loyal to instead of expertise, continuity, institutional understanding, and memory of processes. And so when we see that this seems to be what's happening at the federal government right now, things might move faster in the sense that you might get changes quicker, but it's not clear that you're going to get changes that are better because if we don't have a capacity that's based on institutional knowledge or background understanding of saying, instead just saying, let's do what it is that we think this leader thinks we ought to do, the stuff that we think about that should be technocratic, like we were talking about regulating sort of what you're going to do environmentally if you're an energy company, or regulating healthcare, or regulating how you're going to sell things on the stock market. All of these things are diminished if we're putting loyalty over expertise because loyalty doesn't have that sort of knowledge base to pull from. It has a different incentive structure.
Now, if I was inclined to be more of a conspiracy theory frame of mind, I might say, well, my goodness, this sounds like uh, a strategy, a plot, whatever, of a corporate America to lighten its regulatory load and basically allow it to do more of what it wants and increase its profits at the expense of public health, the environment, and so on. How would you respond to that?
I don't know that I would see that as a wildly conspiratorial thought. If we think the idea of ungoverning is essentially like subtracting capable elements of government that we disagree with because it slows things down or it makes things more difficult for businesses to operate, then the idea that the reduction of that means that businesses can do things in quicker ways or in ways that maybe don't have the public interest in mind over private interests, that doesn't strike me as conspiratorial. That strikes me as sort of like connecting point A to point B and walking on a logic rope that I think is pretty plain to see.
Okay, so one of the things that the Trump administration has done this time around, I think very clearly, is favor loyalty over expertise. So we see right as we record this, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is in big trouble over. So there's a big scandal brewing in over the bombing of Venezuelan apparently drug boats. But he seems to be an example where loyalty uh, to Trump trumped his competence, his experience, his qualifications to be secretary. If you apply that example across his cabinet, across the government, that seems to be very consistently to be ungoverning an attempt to begin to dismantle the administrative state. It's a long rambling way to say, well, do you agree or disagree?
I agree in many ways. I think there's other examples that might even like make it clearer. So like Lindsay Halligan, this new attorney who's been installed, who was trying to be prosecuting against James Comey and Tish James. Both of those things have been thrown out because it's not clear that she was abiding by the law in filing what she needed to file and giving things to grand juries in the first place. And the same thing with Pete Hegseth is we're starting to now see pushback from both Democrats and Republicans and saying like, wait a second, for our members of Congress who have served in the armed services, they know that you don't double tap or second shot, or if you have something that's meant to be like injurious to a party and it works, it's not meant to be that then you go back and do like a double make sure they're dead. Instead, the duty is you're obligated to offer care. And so I think we're seeing sort of like the ramp up of what it is to have more loyalists in office or more loyalists in positions. But we're also now, at least on the American side, just starting to see pushback on all these little edges from both Democrats and Republicans.
So what does that mean by pushback? Because I remember interviewing Professor Kristen van de Biesenbos from the Western California Law School, and she was saying at the beginning of Trump 2.0 that we'll see how well the constitutional guardrails contain Trump as he pushes against them. So is that what we're seeing when you say pushback? Are we seeing the guardrails trying to contain Trump's as he begins to move, try to move into areas that are maybe unconstitutional and illegal?
Well, I think we've seen a little bit of that from the courts. We've seen, a lot of the narrative is the courts are giving President Trump everything they want. I don't think that's actually true. There's district courts and appellate courts, and the federal Supreme Court is sometimes stepping in and not granting the wishes that the president wants. So the courts have been doing this for a while. The question is like, what about members of Congress? Do they have the like chutzpah to say like, I'm going to push back even though this is the leader of my party for the Republican side? And on most issues, at least in the way that I'm seeing it and how they're talking to constituents, we're not. But on some of these bigger issues, like this question about can we just continue to strike Venezuelan boats without sort of like some notion of due process or some declaration of war that has to come from Congress, that is starting to rankle Republican members. Whether or not they decide to pass some legislation trying to rein something in, open question. I don't see it happening, not for the foreseeable future, but things could ramp up. And the fact there's even people who are vocal about it is some indication that a guardrail at least is being pushed up against and holding a little bit for now.
How is all of this being cast in the bigger narrative? Thinking about the administrative state and all of these attempts to undermine it, gut it, dismantle it, and so on. Because my understanding is that it's seen as kind of a restoration of the way American government used to run, a kind of a political reclamation project. Is that fair to say?
I think that's very fair to say. And it's also couched in this language of like, we are doing something to take out fraud, waste, and abuse. Or there's corruption in this system. And so we're rooting that out. Or there's something that looks like woke style bias that the left has been putting into government enterprise that we're removing. No one in the Republican conference is saying we're reducing the capacity of our government to act. They're not really outright saying that. But if you can couch it in some language that says like we're doing a good thing or a duty to the American people or getting us back to the way that it was, then all of this sort of ungoverning or quiet deletion or quiet subtraction is at least far more palatable because it seems like it's being couched in really nice moral language, something that we should aspire to do. We should go back to better, easier, simpler, better government times, despite the fact that that might not be what's happening under the hood.
What that raises the question of do the Republicans who don't like the language of ungoverning want to cast it as something else? But how widespread is this they may not call it ungoverning, but do they hold the ideas of ungoverning? Is that widespread in the Republican members of Congress?
That's hard to say because different members of Congress have different orientations, but we understand that the Republican Party, compared to the Democratic Party, tends to be on the side of smaller government in name, but that doesn't necessarily mean not government. It sometimes means state government. Like we'd like people to be able to make these decisions closer to home instead of nameless, faceless bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. And so it's not something that's like universally held. We know that different state delegations have different flavors of this, but it is held more so than within the Democratic Party.
So that speaks to the complexity of this. And in complexity, agendas like ungoverning can be difficult to discern because you've got this idea of you've got the federal government, you've got the states governments, you've still got municipal governments. All of them are renegotiating and arguing and fighting over different areas of jurisdiction. You have federal agencies and state agencies and so on. Does that make it easier to, if we take the premise that Trump is trying to ungovern, and maybe does it make it easy to hide the agenda in the midst of all that complexity?
It's far easier to hide things in that way. You don't have as many people who would even be in places to be whistleblowers. So, for instance, when we think about pardons that President Trump is issuing, before he started to do this tear of pardons of the last 7 months or so, he first gutted out the pardon attorneys that were working there in the first place and put people who were far more loyal to him and loyal to the idea that the executive can do no wrong. This is an absolute power that I have. And people don't oftentimes pay attention to these things because our day-to-day life doesn't turn on who's still in jail or who's not. But when we don't have capable people who are able to sound the alarm from inside, we're having to rely on people who are exerting oversight who maybe used to have that job. There's like a number of social media influencers who try to watch every day, like who gets pardoned and talk about it. But all of this is about less career expertise inside these administrative agencies to do it, which means oversight has to come from somewhere else. And so there's just a reduced capacity for anyone to do it, whether that's seeing it in the first place or calling it out, because everything's a little bit weaker when there's fewer capable people on the inside.
Lindsay, thank you very much for these insights.
Thank you for talking with me.